Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And ultimately, it is actually fine, to be fair, to want to just maintain. I think that that's fine in many cases. An example of that would be like me at the moment. Like I'm doing a lot of jujitsu. Okay, so that's kind of like my primary training goal. So if I have to choose between going to jiu-jitsu or getting in maybe a third or fourth lifting session or whatever, a lot of the time I'm going to pick the jiu-jitsu, because when I look at my goals and I say to myself, right, how much of a benefit are you going to get, Gary, from working on your skill in that sport versus more strength conditioning? For me, working on the skill is more important, because I've been doing strength and conditioning work for like a decade. That's all I've been doing all along. Whereas for someone else, it actually might be a better idea for them, if they've got no strength conditioning background, their fitness is a limiting factor, to skip maybe some of the drilling that day and get their strength work in or get their conditioning work in. So for me, when I'm going to the gym, let's say I'm doing 2 or 3 days of lifting along with the jiu-jitsu, I'm not really expecting to be laying down slabs of muscle or seeing big increases in weight. I'm going there to more or less maintain my strength and maintain my muscle mass while doing those other tasks, while realizing that if I was to totally remove the stimulus of training, I would lose a bit of muscle and I would probably lose a bit of that top end strength. So I'm maintaining those qualities, maybe making some progress on them every now and then, but not near the top end. So even for someone that's been training for a long period of time, while you do have to work very hard to make those progression steps, there's still some sort of range there where there's a certain amount of training at which, yeah, you're going to be adapting, but it's going to be a very long period of time and not something you're seeing. And then there's the kind of top end where you're just focusing on this thing, and you might be adding 2.5 kilos to the bar each month, which is fantastic if you're an advanced lifter. You'd be delighted with that. So yeah.
Just on that as well, like this is a concept as well where, like, again, it goes back to what are your actual goals with all this stuff. Like there's so many goals that we could potentially have with all of the training that we could be doing, all the health, fitness stuff, etc. Right? And like the stuff that you're talking about there is basically a concept of, we'll call it gaintaining, although a lot of Americans call it main gaining, which is
Oh my God.
completely wrong. I'm sorry if you were American. I know we have a lot of American listeners. If anyone says main gaining, just tell them that they do not speak the English language, because that
Dear
is
God.
disgusting. Gaintaining is what we call it, right? Where you're basically trying to get a little bit of gain while you're actually just focusing on maintenance. You're just basically like, I'm doing the minimum required to see some sort of progression. Ideally, there's some progression happening over however many weeks, months, whatever. But you're kind of just happy with maintaining. As long as you maintain, you're kind of happy. If you see a gain, happy, right? So again, it comes back to your goals. Like, what is the actual goal for what you are doing? Because not everyone has the exact same goal. Like, and you've definitely seen this before, where someone's discussing something online about resistance training, whatever, and they are talking about something that is completely antagonistic to the goals of the individual that they're talking to. They're just like, oh, like, why are you not bigger or something? And the individual is like, well, actually, my sport is, I don't know, running. I'm just here to get a bit stronger. It's like, it's like, I don't want to be bigger. And so we have to be very clear on the goals, right? However, for the vast majority of people, we want to at least know how to progress our training, right? And that's what this episode is about, right? But it is important to understand that the kind of context for all this stuff, that you can't borrow from the ether. You have to have already adapted to be able to progress your training. Like, you can't just do more without actually being able to do it. That would be, well, effectively overreaching. And you can't really do that with strength. You can't just like overreach, lift more. You can to some extent if someone helps you. You can be like, all right, I'm going to do the eccentric on my own. But even with that in mind, you already had adapted to be able to do that eccentric on your own. So anyway, look, that's a bit of a tangent. Overall, we need to know the triggers, I suppose you would call them, for this progressive overload. Like, what are the switches that we're going to flip if we're trying to progress our training? Because it's one thing to know how to train, right? And I think everyone at this stage of listening to the podcast series should know how to train. It's like, we've talked about the different variables, like from the perfect rep. We've talked about like the tempo, controlling the movements, even exercise selection to an extent, looking at, anatomy, that kind of stuff. Like, we've done a lot. We've covered a lot already, right? So assuming right now we're at a stage where you selected your goals, you're pretty clear on your goals, you've selected some sort of rep range because you're like this rep range, well, maybe you've picked a few different exercises, you've selected your rep range, you're like this rep range, makes sense for my goals. Let's say again, for the vast majority of people listening to this, it's somewhere in that range of 6 to 15 reps, somewhere there, right? And you're like, as long as I'm getting stronger in those reps, happy days, right? And then you've allocated volume accordingly. So again, maybe for you, you're like, oh, actually, my quads, I want to really build those up. Again, we'll use you as an example, Gary. Maybe you're like, you know what, I actually just want to roughly maintain what I've got, but I still would actually like to see a little bit more progress on my quads, right? You might be like, okay, so everything else is on maintenance volume, like I'm doing the minimum effective dose, but for my quads, because I want to build them up, I'm actually doing a little bit more, right? So we're allocating volume accordingly, right? So we're doing, and usually we talk about that through the number of sets that we're doing, right?